3 days after the World Cup ended, thousands of British passports were already being renewed, but not for another vacation. Something far more unsettling was beginning to unfold. Millions of British fans had returned home carrying a feeling they never expected. They wanted to go back. The America they had been warned about had vanished before their eyes, replaced by warmth, freedom, opportunity, and a strange energy that made life back home suddenly feel colorless. Now, memories of Texas barbecue, endless highways, and the kindness of complete strangers were feeding a question many never imagined they would ask. What if America wasn't the place they had been taught to fear, but the place they had been searching for all along?
Person in America for the World Cup, and here are some things that I found absolutely crazy about the United States. Number one, there are actually nice people in America. People have been very kind to me and very helpful, and I didn't know that America had nice people. Number two, there aren't any guns. I walk around the street and it is perfectly safe. I thought people would be dying in the street like there was a civil war, but no, I haven't seen one gun. Except go to the shooting range and I shoot one myself and it's very fun. Number three, there's actually good food. I would not have guessed that in a country with almost 400 million people, that there could actually be a meal that was worth trying. Who knew that outside of France?
The first thing many British fans began to miss after returning home wasn't the food, the sunshine, or even the excitement of the World Cup. It was something they couldn't photograph or pack into a suitcase, the way America had made them feel. For weeks, they had grown accustomed to strangers looking them in the eye, cashiers starting genuine conversations, neighbors waving from across the street, and ordinary people treating enthusiasm as something to encourage rather than mock. When someone spoke about an ambition, Americans often seemed more interested in asking how they planned to achieve it than explaining why it would probably fail. To many British visitors, that almost stubborn optimism was one of the most unexpected culture shocks of the entire journey. Only after returning home did they understand how deeply they had become accustomed to it. The streets were still familiar and their old routines were waiting exactly where they had left them. Yet something suddenly felt different. Heads seemed to be down again, conversations felt shorter, and the atmosphere appeared heavier than they remembered. Britain had not changed while they were away. America had simply changed what they noticed. Perhaps that is why some visitors described their experience as if someone had turned the color back on. What surprised them wasn't simply that Americans appeared happier, but that optimism seemed woven into everyday behavior. In a country shaped for generations by people who crossed oceans, moved west, rebuilt after failure, and believed that tomorrow could be different from yesterday, the instinct to look forward became more than a personality trait. It became part of the American character, and this is where the story becomes strangely emotional for older Americans watching from home, because the things foreigners found remarkable were often the very things Americans had stopped noticing about themselves. Holding the door for a stranger, offering directions without being asked, starting a conversation in a grocery store, or making a visitor feel as though they belonged were never supposed to be extraordinary acts. For generations, they were simply part of everyday American life. Many older Americans have spent years wondering whether that America was slowly disappearing. Yet here were visitors crossing the Atlantic, arriving with doubts and stereotypes, only to discover that beneath the political noise and dramatic headlines, much of that spirit was still alive. They found it in small towns and big cities, at gas stations, restaurants, stadium parking lots, and in conversations with people whose names they would probably never know. Perhaps these British fans weren't discovering a new America at all. Perhaps they were holding up a mirror and reminding Americans of something they had become too accustomed to appreciate. That the greatest attraction of the United States may never have been its skyscrapers, highways, or wealth, but the belief that tomorrow can still be better, and the willingness to make a complete stranger feel welcome while chasing it. And once the British began questioning everything they thought they knew about the American people, an even bigger assumption was about to collapse, because the country they had been taught to fear was turning out to be very different from the one standing directly in front of them.
told us this World Cup would be a disaster. America is too divided, they said. Well, they got it completely wrong. And it's got nothing to do with the football. 50,000 Scots taking over Boston, drinking the bars dry, traffic cones on statues, refusing to get flights home, England fans in Dallas singing Sweet Caroline at the rodeo, Japan fans splitting the G and going mental in Houston. This country has let the incredible vibes flow, and it has been a pure, unadulterated joy to see everyone getting involved. And I've seen the excitement firsthand. I spent the last 2 months here visiting all 16 host cities for a food documentary on my YouTube channel. So I wasn't surprised when I watched this incredible nation come together and embrace the world. But it has been an absolute pleasure to see everyone's media-driven view of this great country shattered by the reality. And if you want to watch the food documentary, all 16 episodes are on my YouTube channel now.
The second shock was far more uncomfortable, because this time the British visitors were not simply discovering something new about America. They were beginning to question how they had formed their image of the country in the first place. Before arriving for the World Cup, many had heard the same warnings repeatedly. America was dangerous, deeply divided, unpredictable, and perhaps even foolish to visit during such a massive international event. For years, much of what reached them across the Atlantic had been a steady stream of shootings, political confrontation, protests, crime, and social conflict. Those problems are real, and no serious person would pretend otherwise. But after spending weeks traveling through American cities, many visitors encountered another reality that rarely travels around the world with the same intensity. They encountered ordinary life. They saw families taking children to restaurants, women walking through busy neighborhoods, strangers holding doors, fans from different countries sharing food before games, and millions of Americans simply going to work, raising families, and living lives that looked nothing like the permanent crisis they had expected. Some visitors who arrived nervous began asking an obvious question. If America was supposed to feel like a constant emergency, why did so much of everyday America feel so remarkably normal? There is a simple reason this gap can become so large. News is designed to report what is unusual, disruptive, and important enough to interrupt ordinary life. A peaceful neighborhood where nothing happened today will never travel around the world as quickly as a frightening incident where something did. Over enough years, however, people thousands of miles away can begin mistaking the collection of America's worst moments for a complete portrait of America itself. That realization carried a particular meaning for older Americans, many of whom have watched their country described from the outside for decades. They know America has problems because they have lived through wars, recessions, crime waves, political divisions, and periods when the country seemed uncertain about its own future. Yet they also know something that cannot easily be captured in a headline. The overwhelming majority of American life happens between those dramatic moments, in neighborhoods and communities where people continue helping one another regardless of what the television says. Perhaps this was the America the World Cup visitors had never been shown clearly enough. Not a perfect America, and certainly not an America without danger, but a country far more complicated, hospitable, and human than the frightening image they had carried across the Atlantic. For many Americans, there was something deeply satisfying about watching that transformation happen in real time. The visitors had not been forced to change their minds, and nobody needed to hand them a patriotic speech. America simply had to let them walk its streets, meet its people, travel between its cities, and decide for themselves. And slowly, the country they had feared from thousands of miles away began to disappear, replaced by the America standing directly in front of them. But once that first wall of fear came down, the British began noticing something else that made returning home even more difficult. America wasn't merely friendlier than they expected. In many ways, everyday life also felt bigger, easier, and more convenient than they had ever imagined. The third shock did not fully reveal itself until many British fans returned home and stepped back into the spaces they had considered completely normal all their lives. Suddenly, the roads seemed narrower, the cars felt smaller, the stores more confined, and even ordinary homes appeared strangely compact. Nothing had physically changed in Britain during their absence, but after several weeks in America, their sense of scale had. In the United States, they had driven along highways stretching toward the horizon, walked through supermarkets large enough to feel like small towns, climbed into SUVs with more interior space than some European apartments, and discovered that buying a gallon of milk or a drink large enough to last an entire afternoon was considered perfectly ordinary. Even small conveniences, from ice makers built into refrigerators to powerful air conditioning in stores where almost everything could be found under one enormous roof, began to reshape their expectations of what everyday life could feel like. To Europeans, this can easily look like an American obsession with excess, but there is a deeper story behind the scale. America developed across an enormous continent where distance shaped daily life, and as highways, suburbs, shopping centers, and automobile culture expanded, much of the country was built around a simple idea. If people had more room, why not use it? Over generations, physical space became closely connected to an American idea of personal freedom. The freedom to move, to build, to own, and to live without feeling constantly compressed by the world around you. Older Americans understand this transformation better than almost anyone. Many watch the interstate highway system connect places that once felt impossibly distant, saw suburbs expand beyond old city limits, and remember when the family road trip became a symbol of possibility rather than simply transportation. What a British visitor sees today as an enormous highway or an oversized store is, in many ways, the physical result of decades of Americans building a country around movement, abundance, and convenience. Of course, bigger does not automatically mean better, and America has paid its own price for distance, traffic, and dependence on cars. But for visitors accustomed to tighter spaces and older infrastructure, the psychological effect can still be powerful. There is something difficult to forget about driving beneath an enormous sky on a road that seems to have no end, knowing that another city, another landscape, and another completely different version of America may be waiting just a few hours ahead. Perhaps that is why returning home felt so strange. The British had not simply become accustomed to larger cars or wider roads. They had briefly experienced a different relationship with space itself. America had given them the sensation that there was always more room ahead, and once you become accustomed to that feeling, the familiar world you return to can suddenly seem smaller than it did before you left. Yet size and convenience were only part of what made leaving America so difficult, because there was one experience waiting at almost every highway exit, stadium parking lot, and roadside restaurant that attacked something even more primitive than their sense of freedom, their appetite. And for British visitors who had arrived believing American food was little more than oversized fast food, what happened next was almost embarrassing. The fourth shock attacked something far more difficult to reason with, the appetite. Many British visitors had arrived believing one of Europe's oldest stereotypes, that American food was simply fast food made bigger, sweeter, and less healthy. Then they tasted the America that rarely appears beneath the golden arches, and another assumption began falling apart. A real Texas brisket smoked for hours was nothing like the barbecue they thought they understood. Southern cooking introduced flavors they could not easily find back home, while strange combinations like hot salty fries dipped into a cold chocolate shake went from something they mocked to something they suddenly wanted again. But the deeper surprise was that American food was never really one cuisine. It was a map of the people who built the country. Generations of immigrants arrived carrying recipes, spices, and memories of home, and America absorbed those traditions, mixed them together, and often created something entirely new. From barbecue and Southern cooking to Italian-American pizza, Cajun and Creole traditions, the American table became a reflection of the country itself, different cultures arriving from different places and contributing something to a larger story. For many older Americans, there is a quiet source of pride in that history. Foods that once belonged to a single immigrant neighborhood eventually became part of everyday American life, passed from one generation to another until they became inseparable from the country itself. The British had arrived expecting burgers and oversized portions. Instead, they discovered that traveling across America could mean entering a completely different food culture every few hundred miles. And by the time they were packing bottles of American sauce into their luggage and wondering where they would ever find real smoked brisket again, the stereotype of a country with no real food culture had become almost impossible to defend. But another realization was waiting for them outside the restaurant. They had spent their entire lives watching America on a screen, and now they were beginning to discover that Hollywood had not invented nearly as much as they thought. The fifth realization was the strangest of all, because the British had been preparing for this moment their entire lives without ever knowing it. They had grown up watching yellow school buses roll through suburban streets, pickup trucks crossing endless highways, enormous college stadiums shaking beneath thousands of fans, and ordinary American neighborhoods glowing under Halloween pumpkins and Christmas lights. For decades, America had lived inside their screens. Then, suddenly, they were standing inside it. The yellow school bus was real. The cowboy boots were not costumes. The diners, the highways, the police sirens echoing between skyscrapers, the football stadiums rising like monuments. These were not Hollywood props waiting to disappear when the camera stopped rolling. This was everyday America, and that realization created a strange feeling of arriving somewhere for the first time while somehow remembering it from childhood. Most Americans rarely stop to consider how extraordinary that is. For generations, the United States exported more than movies and music. It exported images of ordinary American life so powerfully that millions of people around the world grew up carrying memories of a country they had never visited. A front porch, a school bus, a family road trip beneath an enormous sky. Ordinary details to one American had quietly become symbols of possibility to someone watching from thousands of miles away. But when the World Cup ended, the British discovered that the America of their childhood imagination was not the hardest thing to leave behind. The people were. Long after the stadium lights went dark, they remembered the stranger who stopped to offer directions, the family who pulled foreign fans into a tailgate, as though an empty chair had been waiting for them all along, the cashier who genuinely wanted to hear where they came from, and the Americans who seemed almost proud to make a visitor fall in love with their country. That is where the story becomes bigger than tourism. Foreigners had arrived expecting to photograph skyscrapers, taste enormous food, and watch football. Instead, they left carrying memories of something no souvenir shop could sell them: the feeling of being welcomed by people who had absolutely no obligation to care whether they enjoyed America or not. For older Americans, there is something deeply powerful hidden inside those reactions. For years, many have watched the country argue with itself, heard that communities were disappearing, and wondered whether the warmth they remembered from another generation had been lost somewhere along the way. Then millions of outsiders arrived, looked at America with completely fresh eyes, and began pointing directly at the things Americans themselves had stopped noticing. The America these visitors fell in love with was not built yesterday. It was an older instinct that survived beneath all the noise. The belief that a stranger does not have to remain a stranger, that there is always room for another chair around the table, and that pride in your country means more when a visitor can actually feel it. And then the World Cup ended, the stadiums emptied, the tailgate grills went cold. Suitcases were closed, boarding passes were scanned, and planes began carrying thousands of British fans back across the Atlantic. Their bodies returned home, but something inside them did not. 3 days later, the streets of Britain looked exactly as they had before, yet the people walking through them were no longer seeing them with the same eyes. They had experienced the scale of America, tasted its extraordinary mixture of cultures, watched childhood images come alive in front of them, and discovered a warmth in ordinary Americans that many had never expected to find. That is why the real story of this World Cup did not end with the final whistle. America hosted the world for a few unforgettable weeks, but somewhere between the highways, the barbecue tables, the stadium parking lots, and the conversations with complete strangers, something far more personal happened. Visitors who arrived asking whether America was really as dangerous, divided, and chaotic as they had been told were leaving with an entirely different question. How do you go back to your old life after discovering a place that made you feel more alive? Of course, visiting America is not the same as building a life there. Every country looks different after the honeymoon ends, and the United States carries real problems that no World Cup vacation can erase. But that does not make what these visitors felt any less real. Sometimes distance reveals what familiarity has hidden, and sometimes it takes the eyes of a stranger to remind a nation what it still has. For Americans watching these reactions, that may be the greatest source of pride in this entire story. The world came expecting spectacle, but the stadiums were not what stayed in their hearts. They came expecting Hollywood, but the movie sets were not what made leaving painful. It was the America between the attractions. The America at the gas station. The America around the barbecue. The America that held the door, offered directions, pulled up another chair and said, "You're welcome here." And now, 3 days after the greatest tournament on earth came to an end, thousands of British fans are waking up thousands of miles away with memories they cannot shake, and one question that refuses to disappear. Did they simply visit America, or did they accidentally discover the place where they finally felt at home? The World Cup gave them a reason to come. America gave them a reason to want to return.